All right, so this is our first Patreon Q&A, and this is accessible to anybody who has a tier 3 or higher Patreon subscription. Now, the way that this is going to work is you can either submit a question by text or so on. We have one of those, and the other option is that you can actually come and be in the session, which will be at 6 Eastern on the last Friday of each month. Tonight we have Brad Russell and Rafael Dorado, and we will start now. All right, so Raphael, you were first on the list, first in. So yeah, what's your first question?
Okay, my first question is about brake balance and especially cars that have in-car adjustment for brake balance. I want to know if you use it during your road races, especially, and how would you use it? Would you design a strategy to use it in a road race, like in a lap-by-lap basis or in a corner-by-corner basis, or maybe earlier or later in the stint?
Okay, so with that, yes, I always use it. In terms of what I do with it, it depends heavily on the car. So when it comes to cars such as GCEs, GC3s, and in the case of the Lotus 49, actually, you're completely open in terms of what you can do with the bias in the in car. So you can kind of go all the way from what is essentially minimum all the way to maximum in terms of the garage range. So your planning for it doesn't have to be as strict as it does for some other cars, which I'll get to in a second. But yes, I always move it around. I don't do it on a corner by corner basis. I know some guys do. I don't. I know that there's potentially advantages to doing so, but it's just a case of it's. I tend to find it's more effort than it's worth, unless you have a really well planned out strategy as to, hey, for this section I'm going to do this, for this section I'm going to do this, and you're really kind of in tune with that. I don't like to mess with it because I find it knocks me out of the rhythm. But over a fuel run, depending on which way the balance is going, I will move it. So say for example on the 911 RSR, as the fuel burns, I tend to move the bias backwards, and I find that helps in that car. In something a bit more obscure, so say when we do the Cup Series on road courses, those cars are limited to plus or minus 3% bias based on what your garage value is. So that really does kind of put you in a box, and it sounds like having 6% adjustment is a lot. And for most road cars, it is, but most road cars seem to sort of you're able to stay really within a 2% range, and everything seems to work quite well, and you don't ever really need to step outside of that. With something like the Cup Series, I find that I generally always have to go forwards on the bias. So for the road course races, what I will do is I will actually set my bias at at -3 as soon as I get into the car to start the race, and that's kind of a preset as to where I want to be at the beginning, and then I have the +6 that I can dial in if I need to, and in some cases I pretty much do end up at the full +6. I think last year at the Charlotte Roval, I was moving 1 to 1.5% every 5 or 7 laps into the run, and that was just necessary to stop the rear wheels locking. It seems to be more of a factor in cars that have an aggressive amount of tire drop off. In cars that kind of stay the same, or actually cars that are really lightweight, they seem to be pretty susceptible to it as well. So in those cars, I will change it a lot.
All right, thanks.
All right, sweet. So now on to Brad for the second question.
Well, I'll kind of just piggyback off of that. So during a run, like what are you using to determine that you need to move the brake balance and how much? Like in the say in a GTE with the lockup lights, what are you looking for, or what are you trying to feel to make those changes?
So GTE is a little bit easier because you have those lockup lights, and what I obviously I drive the Porsche a lot, so I kind of have some specific thoughts related to that car. I don't know how well they'll transfer to others because I'm not 100% on the lockup lights in the other cars, but I'm sure that they've got similar kind of things that you can look at. with the push specifically, I look for one yellow light on the dash, and if I ever see it going to two yellow lights, which is rear locking, then I will dial some bias forwards until I get back to the one. Sometimes if I really need the car to turn, I'll kind of deal with it with two of the yellow lights coming up. I pretty much never ever want the fronts to be locking aggressively first. So a lot of baseline setups, I find that the brake bias is way too far forwards, because as soon as you even touch the brakes, it seems like the fronts lock up. So I do try and run as much rear as pretty much I can stand, and in those cars it's pretty much when there's one to, I want to say 1.5. I know they don't quite work like that, but if the second light is just kind of blinking on and off, then that's kind of okay to me. That's what I aim for.
A follow-up question on the same topic. Do you use the rear brakes to help rotate the car? Like, for example, would you adjust the brake bias herwards if you want the car to rotate more on turning, or do you think that's not a good way to achieve that goal?
Um, it depends. If I can get the car to turn without doing that when I'm building the setup, then that's really the goal. When it's in race, and you don't really have any other options, then yes, the bias is really kind of all you can do, and it is really helpful for that. Now, when it comes to building the setup, it I don't like to rely on it to turn the car if I can help it. There's certain cases where it's it's not really possible to do anything else, but generally I don't like to be reliant upon it like that. It's one of those things that I'm trying to band-aid another problem if it's in race.
Right, thanks.
Yeah, so I had a question about the ARB settings, like in road cars, like a GTE. And how do you know, let's say the car is a little bit understeer, a little bit oversteer, whether to adjust the front or the rear? And then, like how much do you care about how similar those are? Do you care if they get way far apart? And if so, what do you do?
Okay, so with this, when it comes to, so say that if you have a lot of understeer with the car, then I will try and soften the front bar first to try and fix it that way. And kind of the point where I stop going lower on the front bar is when you really start to feel, particularly on turning on, and to a lesser extent on corner exit, but you really notice it on turning. If you turn the car in and it feels like there's no support on the outside wheel, and the car turns extremely aggressively, almost kind of too fast. But then as it gets to the middle of the corner, it kind of starts to push still. That's sort of the point where, to me, it feels like you're kind of at the lower limit in terms of how much roll stiffness you've got at that end of the car. So at that point, I would move then to the rear of the car and start increasing it. Generally, I don't like to run particularly large rear anti-roll bars, because I think they give you bad handling characteristics, especially on bumpy corner exits, where you can end up with situations where you're actually losing drive off, because say you've got a wheel on a curb and it's affecting the opposite corner kind of thing. So I tend to work on the front first until I get to the point where it feels like I don't have enough stiffness, and then I move to the back of the car. And if neither of those solves it, then I then have to start looking at other things, and the number one thing I normally look at in that sort of situation is rake and aero config.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
All right, so a follow-up question on the same topic. You have springs, of course, like in the 49, and ARBs to adjust the balance, but you can also adjust both at the same time, not to change the balance, but just to change what set of springs you have or what pair of RABs you have, even if you keep the same overall balance. Is that something you do to search for uh, which combination has more grip, even though they may have the same balance? Like, would you decrease both RMBs at the same time just to test, or do you think this is a waste of time?
No, no, I think that's actually a really good thing to do, and that's something that I do like to do, especially in cars which have got those kind of options. Anything that has in car adjustable ARVs is really helpful, for testing that out, because you can do it kind of in real time. A lot of other cars you kind of have to go into the garage and change either the overall diameter of the bar and drop it down, or change the number of arms and so on. In cars such as the 49, it's actually interesting you mentioned that, because when I was doing laps at Brands Hatch last week, that's actually exactly what I was doing. I would move them in, as a pair, both increasing and decreasing in two positions at a time, to kind of feel out what was different, and whether even if the overall balance was the same, if there was an advantage to having overall higher or lower stiffness. So yeah, it's definitely something that I mess with. In terms of cars that don't have the in-car adjustments, you can do it still. It's just a bit more tricky because it's harder. You don't have that instantaneous back to back like you do with the actual the in-car adjustments, and it's a little bit harder to get a good read on where you are. But yeah, it's definitely something that I think is worth doing, because it tends to not be a huge difference, but even if it makes you just feel more comfortable in the car, it's definitely worth going with, I think.
Thanks.
Hey, Christian, someone else came in.
Yeah, I saw Figs jumped in. So Fig, if you're ready to ask a Q, we'll go to you, and then actually once Figs completed his question, we'll go to the writing question.
Go ahead, right to the right end. I don't have anything in at the moment. I'm trying to think of stuff actually.
Okay, excellent. Well, we'll go to Rocky's writing question. Okay. So his question was this. It was regarding ballast in oval stock cars and trucks, and he said, I know that on short tracks and road courses it's preferred to have ballast as far back to the rear as possible if you can make it work. But should that be a starting point for 1.5 miles, and bigger tracks? If you can do an overview of ballast and its effect at speedways, that'd be a big help to me. Okay, so yes, and there's actually a couple of road cars that also have ballast adjustment too, but this is mainly the higher tier stock cars, though things like the Super Late model and I believe the Arca car as well also has ballast adjustment. But this is really focused on Cup, Xfinity, and Truck. And the thing with Cup, Xfinity, and Truck is they all seem to have different zero references in terms of where the ballast is. So you do have to kind of keep that in mind. You can't just say, oh, okay, I run 28 inches of ballast in Cup, therefore I can run 28 inches of ballast in the truck or the Xfinity car. The other thing to go with that as well is that all three have different aero configs, which means that the ideal ballast position for each car is going to be different. That said, the general principles apply the same on all three of them. So when it comes to road courses, yes, you pretty much always will see the ballast block be as far rearward as possible, and that really comes down to there being no significant advantage in having the ballast forwards, and the reason for that is twofold really. One, when it comes to road courses, we tend to find that the corner radiuses on them are quite small compared to what we're used to on ovals. So a good example of this would be a track like Sonoma versus, say, a track like Las Vegas. Obviously, Las Vegas, the corner radiuses are massive and they're extremely long, whereas at, say, Sonoma, it's mostly constant switchbacks and really tight hairpins or 90-degree turns. So in those cases, it's not helpful to have the ballast far forwards because it reduces the response of the car and basically makes it lazy. So having the ballast all the way back helps you to rotate the car quicker, essentially. So it's helpful for road courses in that sense. The other thing is that if you put the ballast forwards, you're putting more weight towards the front of the car, which is advantageous when there's a lot of aero force, because what you are doing when you're putting the ballast forwards is you're kind of moving the mechanical balance forwards as well. You're moving the inherent center of gravity of the car forwards, and to have a stable car, generally you want that point, that center of gravity of the car, to be ahead of the aero balance point. Because if the aero balance point is ahead of the center of gravity, the thing is pretty much always going to be unstable. Obviously, at road courses, the speeds aren't nearly as high, so that's less of a factor. That's less of a consideration. But the other thing you're doing by putting the ballast forwards is you're taking a lot of weight off the rear wheels, and you have a lot of slow speed traction zones at road courses. So actually moving the ballast forwards starts to hurt you in these regions, and you start to end up with actually losing bite off the corners. And this is where it transitions a little bit into short tracks, because short tracks such as Martinsville are more similar to a road course in this sense, and having the ballast further back is going to give you more traction on a corner exit, and the aero is obviously much less of a factor because the speeds are so low. Now, when you start to move up to slightly faster short tracks, say Phoenix, Richmond, that's where the aero starts to come more back into play, and that consideration of where the center of gravity is in relation to where the aero balance is starts to become more of a factor, and that's why you start to see the ballast start to go forwards on those tracks. Now, when you move it to mile and a halves, the aero effect and the aero balance location versus the center of gravity starts to become way more dominant, and because there's a when you're kind of transitioning in and out of the corner, there's a smaller relative difference in terms of speed. So between straightaways and the mid corners, it kind of moves away from the traction being important, and it becomes more about stability and kind of having good control of the nose. So that's why you see the ballast start to go forwards on the faster tracks, and it's even more of a consideration in things like the truck and the cup car, especially because the cup car is flat out at so many places now. So you'll find that putting the ballast forwards gives you more inherent stability and allows you to run wide open for longer without consideration of the rear tires kind of slipping. And generally you'll see the faster the track and the more aggressive the banking transition, the further forward the ballast will go, because it helps out in these things. Now, the interesting thing is that when you start to get to the very, very large tracks, such as Michigan is almost like this. So Michigan, Auto Club, Daytona, and Talladega. When you get to those tracks, you find that you don't really need the stability, because you kind of already have more inherent grip than you need in the car. So what you can do actually at those tracks is you can start pulling the ballast backwards, and the reason you do this is because it keeps the rear down, and it actually results in more consistent splitter heights as well. So you can start the nose of the car lower, and the rear stays lower, so you get a little bit more straightaway speed by having the ballast shunted all the way rearwards. That's why you'll see plate track setups such as Daytona and Talladega. They will generally run the ballast all the way at minimum again. So it's this kind of confusing thing where you go from road courses and short tracks where the ballast is all the way back. Then you start moving into faster short tracks and the ballast starts going forwards. Then you move into mile and a halves and the ballast is kind of in the middle, and then you move to mile and a halves with big banking transitions such as Charlotte, and the ballast is now really far forwards. And then you start moving to Michigan and Auto Club where the straightaway speed factor comes in, and the ballast starts coming back again. And then you go out to Daytona and Talladega, and the ballast is all the way rearwards. So I hope that answers what you were asking. I feel like it does. I feel like that's pretty much the best overview of ballast and its effects that I can give. So Fig, have you is that giving you enough time to think of a question?
currently no. I'm driving the cup car now to think of see if anything comes to mind.
Okay.
I did have to go. I'll say a quick thing. I did have to go up on the downforce, for sure on what I was running earlier on that setup. I did an AI race and there was no hanging on with the AI. They were a lot quicker through the corners.
Yeah, and that's kind of another thing when it comes into that's one of the biggest things actually right now in terms of especially the cup car is picking what level of aero trim, and that's another thing actually that comes back to the ballast point. The where depending on where you are in terms of aero trim is going to affect where you want to be in terms of ballast. So, say for the cup car, as you raise the rear of the car, what it does do is it adds more downforce to the car, but it also seems to move the aero balance forwards. So you have to counter that really with additional forward ballast. And obviously, as you then drop the rear of the car down, you pull the ballast the other way, and again that's kind of how the Daytona and Talladegas sort of come into this, where you're running the rear of the car completely slammed to the ground, and because of that you don't have the aero balance forwards inherently, and then the ballast comes back as well, and it kind of all works together, and it does work out. It's one of those things where you kind of have to see it a little bit yourself to kind of get completely on board with it, but it definitely is there, and once you've made kind of setups for all the tracks, you really do start to notice these trends. But since Fig is now still thinking of a question, I can't remember exactly what order we were in and who asked the last question, whether it was Brad or Raphael. I think it was Brad who asked the last question.
Now it's Brad. It's Brad's
Okay,
turn.
okay, so we'll go to Brad now.
Yeah, it's either way. So this is a little bit of a follow up for the road stuff you were talking about before. With the you're talking about the ARB affecting traction and drive off, and so my question was, I've had this happen twice recently where I'm having a hard time getting traction down, leaving the corner where you get into the traction control a whole lot. And what do you look at to try to correct that? Like, what are you looking at first? And kind of go with that, a few of these times or a lot of the tracks I've had the rear ARB at fours or fives, so that could be part of it. But with the diff and ARB and rake and all that, like how are you trying to get more traction at the rear of the car?
So for this, it kind of comes down to what kind of corner we're talking about. So when you're saying struggling with rear traction, are we talking out of a corner such as the tight right-handers at Road Atlanta that lead onto the backstretch, or are we talking high-speed corners?
No, low speed corners that are tighter.
Okay, so for that, generally it's going to be rear springs where I'll look to first. So if I'm struggling with that, I'll try and soften off rear springs. If that doesn't help, then my next thing to go to is to try adding a little bit of toe in the rear. I find that this helps a little bit. It helps to try and get some bite on exit. And if that's still not working, then it's kind of moving on to the drive ramp side of the diff, and in terms of preload and clutch plates, and when it really it's difficult to get much happening, especially if it's in a straight line and you just inherently don't have enough bite. Then there's not really a lot you can do. If you're in a straight line and you think it might be the inside spinning, then the solution is to either add some preload or add a clutch plate or reduce the drive ramp angle. If it's really snappy, you can try you can try increasing the drive ramp angle to sort of take away some of that locking until you get to that point where the inside wheel is spinning. And that can help if the rotation is really aggressive as you're getting into the throttle. It doesn't always work, and it doesn't work if you're in a completely straight line when it's happening. It's only really a factor if you're still sort of turning at the time. Beyond that, there's honestly not really a lot you can do. Some tracks and some corners are just inherently going to be like that, and the reason I kind of brought up Road Atlanta, that turn onto the backstretch, is I find that that's one of them where you're always struggling out of there, and it always feels like you don't have as much kind of rear bite as you would need. But those are the ways I would go about trying to fix it. And if they didn't work, then I'd essentially just put up with it and try and drive around it, either with more traction control or just being smoother on the throttle myself.
Would you worry about the ARB at all and try to soften that up in the rear and find another way to compensate for that? Or
I would if it was particularly bumpy on that specific exit. So if it was quite smooth, and say there was no curbs involved, then no, I wouldn't worry about the ARB, because if there's no curbs, you don't have that effect of the load from the curb being transferred across the car, or say the load from the bumps being transferred across the car. If there is that, if it is a particularly rough corner exit though, then yes, I would potentially look at going lower in terms of ARB stiffness and compensating that with either again a change in the diff. So say increasing the coast ramp angle and reducing the coast side locking force, so that in those situations where say you were off throttle mid corner, where the ARB would previously help you by rotating the car, if that's gone, then the reduced coast locking would kind of hopefully counter that. Or again, it would be one where I'd potentially look at increasing the rear height to kind of compensate for it.
cool.
All right, so my next question is a bit specific about my practice for this week, which is the Lotus 49 at Spa. And I'm having trouble with the balance of the car. The way it is right now, it is a trade-off between oversteer and understeer, because I'm getting some oversteer on corner entry, especially on the slow corners and the corners that have a downhill entry. But also I'm getting a lot of understeer on the exit of the fast corners like Pujon and Blanchimont. So do you have any suggestions of what should I try next to try to bring those together? I mean, reduce the understeer on exit and reduce the oversteer only on entry.
Okay, so for this I feel like your thing for this that might really help is actually diff preload, because it should give you a bit more locking and stability on entry, but then it should actually kind of do the opposite when you're on throttle on exit. It might make it pretty snappy, and I know last week when we talked about it for Brands Hatch, I'm not 100% sure on what it was doing for you. I know that you said that you weren't a big fan of having the preload in the car, but I definitely found that having the preload made it more stable on corner entry. So maybe try that first. The other thing I would try is for the high speed, I would try actually going higher on the rear if you got any scope to do so. That's going to make you looser on the downhill slow corners though. So you'd have to find a way to counter that. Now the way to do that again might actually be to reduce the coast ramp angle, or to go up on the preload. Those are the two things I'd start with to see if that helped. If that still didn't help, then it's getting pretty tricky to do a lot at that point. I know that car has some interesting considerations in terms of how the rear toe works. I'd maybe start looking at trying to help the entry stability in the slow speed corners with trying to get a bit more toe in at the rear, and maybe again trying to get the rear higher. But I know you run into that problem where the toe goes negative, so it might be a case where you actually want to try reducing the rear camber a little bit so that you can get the toe back. Those are the kind of places where I would start. Now, if that didn't work, then it starts to get more difficult, because that car just starts running out of options, it seems, and then it'd become a case of trying to pick one of the previous things. So say the diff options, and trying to pair it up with a different rear ARB, try and actually get it softer. But it's possible then that you end up at the point where the rear isn't stiff enough, and the oversteer that you get. Although in fairness, you actually wanted more rotation in high speed, so that might actually work in your favor to actually reduce the rear ARB and maybe start to actually get some roll oversteer because of that. It's normally something I try and avoid, but it might actually help here.
Right, thanks. Actually, I'm already at the maximum here, ride height, or maximum rake. But I think I'll try to do some tests with the diff, which I haven't tested yet.
Okay. Well, let me know how you get on with those. And I might try a couple of laps myself if I get a chance. And we can kind of see if we can both figure that out. That is a problem that I thought that car would have. Obviously, with kind of having no aero at all, it's you end up with high speed being kind of opposite to the low speed balance.
All right, thanks.
All right, so Fig, whenever you're ready, just let us know. Otherwise, we'll keep bouncing back and forth. So, Brad, if you've got any more questions, we'll go back to you.
Yeah, I've been struggling when I go to a new track and I'm trying to get my setup going, figuring out, starting with the rake and trying to get that dialed in to get things pretty close. I'm just really struggling figuring out when I've gone too far or when I haven't gone far enough, and kind of what you're looking for to with the rake to know that you're in the ballpark of where you want to end up, and then move on to the other stuff. Because I'll think I get there, and then I get a little more comfortable with the setup, and I'll change a bunch of other stuff, and then I'll think I'm off, and I'll go back to rake again and change it, and it'll be better. So, like, what are you looking for with the feel? Like, do you go far enough until it feels sketchy, and then you back up, or how do you tell outside of just doing a whole bunch of laps and going with the fastest?
Well, in fairness, the whole bunch of laps and going with the fastest method is definitely the most rigorous way. But in terms of getting there quickly, what I'll tend to do is I'll tend to build my baseline sort of as I did for the Road Atlanta setup, and then I'll work around those initial heights and say +3 or plus minus 3 to 5 millimeter increments each time. And when it comes to how far do you go before you kind of think it's going slower, obviously lap times is kind of the king when it comes to this. But I do tend to, especially in that car, because the Porsche really has to leverage how much downforce it has, because it doesn't, it has quite poor acceleration compared with the other cars for whatever reason. And it seems like the way to counter that is to just try and carry more mid-corner speed than everything else. So I will try and run the rear as high as possible until it starts to feel sketchy, because that implies that I have the most downforce possible on the car, and that should be generally the fastest configuration. Obviously, there's tracks like Le Mans and Monza where that won't quite be the case, but generally that's what I go for. I go as high in terms of rear heights as pretty much I can stand without the car feeling too on edge.
Yeah, when you say feeling sketchy, are you starting to feel sketchy in the rear end when you get it too high?
Yeah, yes, and specifically with that car, it's actually on the corner entry where it feels like the rear is trying to get away from you, and that's really what limits it for me.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right, so I have a question about practice, and how do you choose? Not how do you choose the weather for practice, but if you practice in different weather conditions when you are practicing for an important race, and if you are doing different setups for different weather conditions, and if you are, what besides the tire pressures are you paying attention when you have more grip fast versus when you have less grip because of the track temperatures?
Okay, so the best example I can think of this is a lesser consideration now, but in the start part of the year, and especially last year when we used to run true dynamic weather for the Coke series, the things that I always focused on the most when it came to making setup changes was actually the qualifying setups, and it mainly came down to how fine the margins were in that series. And what I would try and do is I would open. I would do my thing of opening 25 sessions and logging kind of what the min, max, and average temperatures were and so on. And then I would build setups within that window. And depending on how much time I had, I would kind of increase the number of setups I had. So if I didn't have a lot of time, I would build a minimum temperature, the average temperature, and the maximum temperatures. I would always build the average one first, and then I would adjust the min and maxes around that. And if I had more time, I would slot more setups into those gaps. Now, the reason I said that this was mainly a qualifying thing is because it's kind of in those hot lap sort of areas where you have the biggest differences, I find. And that's obviously in certain series where the competition is extremely high. That's really the biggest gain to be had, is by focusing on the qualifying setups. Now, generally, what it turned out as is in the hotter track temperatures, I would lower the track bar in those cars, and pretty much that tightens the car up. So an equivalent would be probably lowering the ARB in a road course car. And then for the colder temperatures, I would do the opposite. I would increase the track bar. The other thing I would keep a lot of focus on is ride heights. The colder track temperatures meant that you were having higher corner speeds, and if you're kind of already at the very limit in terms of ride heights, in terms of as low as you can go, then the higher corner speeds are probably going to mean that the car that was okay in hot conditions is now touching the track in cold conditions. So that's kind of where I would start looking, is small ARB changes and small ride height changes to counter those effects. So, say for example, going back to the RSR, you might find that in a colder track, because there's more available grip, that the balance shifts rearwards somewhat. So you might actually be able to get away with running the rear higher, so that you actually get some of that turn back. And generally, it seems like this transfers through to race setups as well. So the small adjustments that you would make for a qualifying set, you can then use them as a starting point for, say, if you have a cold weather qualifying set and you've got the notes from what you changed from the hot weather qualifying set, you can try making those same changes to make a cold weather race setup as well, and then do a run on it and make sure it does actually kind of have the characteristics that you expected it to, and it doesn't do anything weird. Like, it doesn't go from being great to all of a sudden sliding all over the place after 5 to 10 laps kind of thing. Generally, though, when it comes to race setups, I don't make that big of a change. I find that I especially if I've made the setups in advance, then cool, yes, I'll race them. I try and stay away from making last minute changes, because generally they've always gone against me. There's been very, very few occasions where making a quick change in, say, warm up based on what I'm looking at the weather has really ever kind of helped me out.
All right, thanks.
Well, I almost shit my pants a minute ago. I lost all my Motec channels, my math channels, but then I found out there's a backup, so I got them back. I was very sad for a second.
All right. Well, whilst you're still working your stuff out, Fig, we'll go back to Brad.
So I've run into this before. Like, let's say I'm running at a track and I'm just having a hard time. The car is just too sketchy overall, and I keep trying to work on it and stuff, and it's still just difficult to drive. What are the easiest ways to add stability to the car? Because, like, where I am, a lot of times if I can get the car more stable but a little slower, I'll be better off. So what are the easiest ways to add stability?
The absolute easiest way, if you've always got the option, is add more wing. If you're already running at max wing, it's lower the rear end of the car.
Easy enough.
And those are honestly the two best ways to do it, and really they're the two biggest factors as well. I mean, when it comes to balance, even on oval cars, rear height is so important to get right that kind of it dominates almost everything else.
Simple enough.
All right, I think I'm done of questions for today because it's getting late in my time zone. So thank you very much for your help. I have a lot of other questions, but I will leave them for the next Q&A and maybe some for tomorrow.
All right. Well, thank you for coming and hanging out. Thank you for asking the questions. And yeah, if you want to ask them either tomorrow in our session or keep them until next time, then yeah, cool. That's absolutely fine, and we'll go from there. And I will catch up with you in the morning.
All right, guys, see you.
All right. Have a good night, Raphael.
See ya. I had a quick question
Okay.
about the. We talked about. You showed me the other day, but I forgot how to do the smoothing on the filters, or like a smooth filter in Motec. I don't know if it's a
Okay.
Q&A worthy question, but
Yep.
I was trying to
No.
figure that out and I couldn't do it.
No, that absolutely is, and I will actually get an example right now to demonstrate how we do that.
Perfect, because I also just deleted one of my math files again. I'm just
Okay.
having a terrible time here.
All right, I will load up some data real quick, and then I will show.
Yeah,
We'll show
don't
how we deal with
accidentally upload your Motec file from the race. Don't do that.
Yeah, that's actually what I'm looking for right now. I'm actually looking to
Oh, you
pick
are?
out I'm looking to pick out a lap, and we'll go from there. Okay, so right, so this will do, and I have it on screen as well.
Mhm.
Okay, so you can't see this right now, Fig, but I'll walk it through for the people who might see this. So when you have the channels open and on screen, you just have to right click on the channel name in the left side. So say when you've got your graphs and so on, if you've got say split or right height,
Yep.
then it opens up a dialog box of things you can do. You can hide the channel, blink the channel, remove the channel, and so on. Further down, there's one that's called filter. If you click that, then you have a couple options. You can either smooth by time, smooth by samples, or you can do a low pass filter cutoff. So to get a quick and obvious result, I'm going to do a 1 Hz low pass filter cutoff. And there you go. You can see by clicking apply, it changes it and filters and smooths the graph. And then if you want it to go away, you simply click reset and apply, and there you go.
Thank you. Because I was doing something like this. I was trying to do a filter in the maths thing, which is really hard to say, but in the math thing, and then somewhere else I was trying to do it, but it just wouldn't let me. It wouldn't apply the filter, but this actually works. So thank you.
No problem. All right. Well, have you got any more extended questions, Fig, or can we pass back to Brad?
You can pass it back to Brad. I don't think something though.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm about done. I have one other question though. Maybe it's easier if I share my screen with Motec, but I've just had a hard time figuring out if the car is on the splitter and is not turning because of that, or if it's something else. Would
Okay.
it be easy to
Yeah.
share it? Okay.
Yeah.
let's
Let's we can do a screen share, and we'll take a look.
All right. So here's the screen. Can you see it?
Yep. I got it.
So do you want me to zoom in on one of the turns? But you can see it's getting like 5 mils below zero on the front.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
But
So you got.
It'll still go negative and it feels kind of okay. So I didn't mean to interrupt you. What do you want to look at?
No, I was just gonna say I'm just looking down into turn 1. You can see pretty clearly that it drops down, and kind of when you have those bits where it's significantly kind of flat. So actually, the turn 1 is kind of good. Yeah, the zoom in makes it actually makes it a little bit less obvious because you don't see it as well. But you can see how it's underneath for a pretty extended period of time there. Do you feel that when you're actually on the brakes?
I'm not sensitive enough to it. It's really hard to tell for me. So like I just struggle being able to tell what the cause is of a problem. And so I've been trying to diagnose, like, is this because I'm letting the front end get too low? And you realize when we were working together, I hit the brakes a little harder than you were, and so I think I was prone to putting it on the nose anyway. Um, so short answer is I don't really know.
Okay.
I'm
Well,
trying to figure out whether that's the splitter's the problem or not.
the thing with this is, are you struggling to turn the car in after this happens?
Yes.
Okay, then I would say that there is a strong possibility that it is a problem because it's dragging to the extent where it's stopping you from turning the car. So I would say that you could try. The first thing I would try is increasing the front springs in terms of stiffness and going again and seeing if the lap times and the feel improves. And if it does, then I would keep increasing the spring stiffness until that positive kind of flattened out, and then I would go with the softest spring that gave me the fastest time or the best feel, if you can see what I'm saying.
Yeah. The closest I can get to feeling what's going on is that it's inconsistent whether it's gonna turn or
Right.
not.
Then yes, then definitely I would say it's on the track to a point where it's affecting you, because there's times where it can be hitting the track surface and it's actually not detrimental to you. You don't feel it, and therefore you can kind of get away with it, because when it comes to stuff like this, there is a trade-off where the obvious thing to do is go, oh, it's 5 mil under the ground. What I'll do is I'll lift it 5 mil and I'll see, and you can go that route, but before you know it, you end up with a car that's 15, 20 mils higher than it needs to be. And then in the corners where you don't have heavy braking, but say high speed like the carousel, your splitter is much higher than is optimum, and then you're losing a lot of time in those high speed corners. So it is a trade off between having the springs stiff to the point where they're not too stiff that they're starting to lose traction in bumpy braking zones and that kind of thing, or say with curbs and so on. And also having the height, the static height so high that you're starting to lose out in the corners where there isn't braking, and the splitter just ends up naturally riding higher because you've got a higher static height.
Yeah, and so I've been raising the front, like, I don't know, 2 or 3 mils, um, and going, like, maybe 1 stiffer on the spring. Would you abandon the increasing the front ride height, just keep going stiffer until it's not hitting or not causing an issue?
Going stiffer on the springs would be where I would start. I generally like to run road cars as low as possible in the front if I can get away with it. So I I would try the stiffer springs first. If the stiffer springs aren't solving it on their own, or it gets to the point where the stiffer springs start to become detrimental, then that's the point where I'll stop going up on the spring and I'll start increasing the static height instead.
Yeah. This is Road America, and I went weaker on the front springs, for some reason, and the car felt better, but then I've noticed that I've had this behavior going on,
What
and
it
now
what it might be worth doing in this case then is to try a combination of both. Try one direction where you've got the soft spring but a high static height, and then try another where you've got a stiff spring but a low static height.
okay.
And then compare the two against each other. When you kind of have when you have a version of each that seems like the best possible route, then compare the two against each other and see which is better out of those, and that should tell you which direction is best.
Okay. Well, that's kinda it for me. I'm out of questions I've got written down.
All right. So, Fig, have you got any questions?
I do actually have something, I guess. Yeah. So I'm working on Michigan, and I got some rear steer in the car with the tow,
Mhm.
and I guess a bit with the track bar. I'm not too versed in knowing how much steer I'm putting in with the track bar, but um, it's good. It's good in the beginning when there's the grip, but then I feel like that's 10 laps in for numbers sake. It's starting to negatively affect me mid corner off, and it's just like too much rotation. Is there um Because the toes are obviously like in one or nothing. There's no like in between. Is there something I can adjust the track bar in a way, or something else to kind of still give me that rear steer, but not nearly as much? Maybe I don't know if there's.
Okay, so with this, I do know what you're talking about. You're getting loose as the run goes on, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And in
So
like a just the same manner. It's just like the car turns so well through the mid corner. Feels great in the beginning, but then later on it's like not enough because it's too much because there's no grip back there.
so the way to there's a couple of ways to deal with this. The the first way, I would try adding a little bit of ballast to the car and seeing if that helps out. If it doesn't, then I would try adding some cross weight to the car, either with higher static cross weight or with increased left rear spring. You'll have to check your ride heights again after this.
Mm.
If neither of those work and the problem still develops, which I have a feeling it might, then the only way, unfortunately, is to move away from the additional rear steer and skew, and to start reducing the track bar rate down itself.
Okay, yeah, because I have a lot of negative rake in the track bar.
When you say negative rake, are we meaning the left
The
side
left
higher?
side's higher. Yeah.
Okay,
If
well
it's
that
negative rake,
actually
it's
that's
positive, I don't know.
that's interesting, because when you were talking about track bar rake, I was assuming that your right side was already higher.
No,
So if
yeah,
it
it's
if
the
it
other way.
if it isn't, if the left side's okay, so if the left side's higher and you're struggling and still would drive off, then I'm fairly certain that the problem is going to be either ballast or crossweight related, because the solutions that I was suggesting, in terms of reducing the rake, was if the right side was higher, and that's actually what I thought was happening in your situation, that the right side was higher, and kind of coming to the corner exit, it was it was kind of pulling the car around. But if you're already at a quite heavily inverted track bar rake, then it's almost definitely that the either the ballast isn't far enough forwards or the crossweight isn't high enough.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
All right. So Brad, you were out of questions, correct?
I think I am.
Okay. Well, Fig, if have you got any more questions to add, or are you?
Nothing to contribute to the whole Q&A. I don't think at the moment. Yeah, I got nothing. Nothing's coming to my head.
Okay. Well, that means that the first Q&A is just under an hour, which is okay with me. I allocate 2 hours for these, but if we run out of questions, we run out of questions, and I think an hour-long video should be actually quite okay for people to listen to. So I will end the recording now. For the people who watch the recording, if you do want to be part of this, then you have to be a tier 3 or higher to join the Q&A directly or submit a question to it. Either way, you'll be able to listen back to them, because I'm going to record all of these, and they're on the last Friday of every month, and they will be at 6 Eastern.